We were talking the other day, and you mentioned some really interesting research on infant feeding practices.
Yes.
And, what really caught our attention was this Australian study that explores the link between, the practice of bottle feeding toddlers to sleep and the long-term impacts that might have on their health, particularly things like, dental cavities and becoming overweight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting because, these early routines that we establish with our kids, they can be really deeply ingrained. And it's fascinating to see research like this that really highlights how these routines might have longer-term effect that we don't always consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this particular study was published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health and draws on data from a really impressive long-term study called the Healthy Smiles Healthy Kids Study, or HSHK.
Okay.
And this study's been running out of Western Sydney University, and they've been following children from birth. So it gives us a really rich and robust data set to understand some of these long-term effects.
Wow, from birth. So they're really tracking these kids over a long period.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it seems like we've got a lot to unpack here.
We do.
Let's kind of dive into what this research uncovered and what the experts are saying about it, and most importantly, what it means for parents and caregivers.
Absolutely.
So, looking at this research, what were some of the key takeaways that really jumped out at you?
Well, one of the things that really surprised me was how common this practice of bottle feeding to sleep still is.
Okay.
The study found that over 30% of 2-year-olds in the study were still being regularly bottle fed to sleep. And, considering that the recommendations are to stop bottle use around 12 months,
right,
it's a pretty significant number. And what's even more interesting is that this continued bottle feeding practice was directly linked to some pretty notable health risks.
Wow, 30%. That's like, almost 1 in 3 toddlers still being given a bottle to go to sleep. That's a lot higher than I would have expected. And you said there were some, pretty significant health outcomes that were linked to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the study found a really clear correlation between bottle feeding to sleep and both excess weight and dental cavities.
Okay.
And at age 2, the children who were bottle fed to sleep were almost twice as likely to be classified as overweight.
Wow.
And then when they looked at the data at age 3, those same children had nearly twice as many teeth that were affected by decay.
So almost double the likelihood of being overweight and double the instances of tooth decay.
Exactly.
Those are pretty striking statistics.
They are. And it really makes you think about what's going on. Why would there be this connection? And I think one of the interesting things that the lead author of the study, Hai-Luk Cheng from the University of Sydney, pointed out was that most parents are really trying to do the right thing. They want what's best for their kids, but there might be a lack of awareness about the specific risks associated with this particular bedtime feeding method.
Right. It's not always obvious. You think you're doing something to soothe and comfort your child.
Exactly.
And you don't necessarily think about the long-term consequences that it might have.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point because, as parents, we're bombarded with so much information and it can be hard to know what to trust and what to prioritize.
Right. And we know there are guidelines in Australia around, transitioning away from bottles.
Yes.
Could you just remind us what those recommendations are?
Absolutely. So the Australian guidelines recommend introducing cup feeding around 6 months of age.
Okay.
And aiming to stop bottle use completely by 12 months. And as Hai-Luk Cheng highlighted, bottle feeding in bed is not recommended at any age.
Okay, at any age.
Yeah, and I think this research really reinforces the importance of those guidelines because it shows that there are tangible health risks associated with not following those recommendations.
So let's break it down a little bit.
Sure.
Why is nighttime bottle use linked to dental decay in young children?
Well, it really comes down to what's in those bottles.
Okay.
So common drinks that toddlers are given in bottles, things like cow's milk and formula, they contain sugars either naturally occurring or added. And when a child falls asleep with a bottle, those sugary liquids can basically pool around their teeth all night long.
Oh.
And that prolonged exposure gives the bacteria in their mouth a real feast. And they produce acids that eat away at the tooth enamel, which leads to cavities.
So it's like a prolonged sugar bath for their teeth overnight.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to avoid giving bottles in bed because it just creates that perfect environment for tooth decay.
And what about the link to excess weight? Why might feeding a child to sleep with a bottle contribute to them becoming overweight?
Well, the researchers suggest that it often comes down to the purpose of the feeding. So sometimes bottle feeding at bedtime is used more as a soothing mechanism to help the child settle and fall asleep rather than because they're actually hungry. And this can lead to the child consuming more calories than they need, which over time can contribute to excess weight gain. And it can also interfere with the child's ability to recognize their own hunger and fullness cues.
So it's really about distinguishing between feeding for comfort versus feeding for actual nutritional needs.
Absolutely.
And, sometimes we might think, oh, well, baby teeth, they're not that important. They're going to fall out anyway.
Yeah.
But this research really highlights that early childhood dental health is crucial.
It is, and I think that's a really important message for parents to hear, because dental decay in baby teeth can actually have long-term consequences.
Really?
Yeah. It can affect the development and alignment of their permanent teeth, and it could even impact things like their eating habits and their speech development.
Wow. So it's much more significant than just, oh, it's just a baby tooth, it'll fall out.
Exactly, yeah.
So given all of this information, what kind of advice are the experts giving to parents and caregivers?
Well, Hailuk Cheng really emphasizes the importance of seeking guidance from trusted healthcare professionals. So that's your GP, your child and family health nurse, and of course your dentist.
Right.
And she also recommends consulting reputable resources that provide evidence-based information on infant and toddler feeding practices.
Okay. And we know there are some support systems in place here in Australia to help with children's dental care.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So one of the things she mentioned was the Child Dental Benefits Scheme, which can help cover the cost of basic dental services for eligible children.
Okay.
And the Raising Children's Network recommends that children have their first dental checkup by the age of 1 or within 6 months of their first tooth erupting, whichever comes first.
So early intervention is key.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like those primary healthcare providers like child and family health nurses and GPs, they have a really important role to play here as well.
They do.
Yeah.
They're often the first point of contact for families, and they're really well placed to monitor a child's overall growth and development, including healthy weight gain, and they can provide guidance on feeding and refer families to specialist services if needed.
So it's really a team effort.
Definitely, yeah.
Now, you mentioned some reputable resources earlier.
Yes.
Can you just remind our listeners what those organizations are?
Absolutely. So for reliable information and support on things like breastfeeding infant and toddler feeding dental health and overall child development, parents can turn to organizations like Cavities Tresillian and the Raising Children's Network.
Okay, those are all great resources that parents can access.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that this research itself was quite a collaborative effort.
It was, yeah.
It wasn't just one institution involved.
Right. No, the Healthy Smiles, Healthy Kids study is led by Western Sydney University, but it involves researchers from the University of Sydney Local Health District, Southwestern Sydney, Local Health District, the University of Queensland, UTS, and Curtin University. So it's a really impressive collaboration.
Yeah, it really highlights how complex these issues are and the value of bringing together different experts.
Exactly.
And of course, research like this requires funding. So who are the key funding bodies that supported this important work?
The research received funding from the NHMRC, NSW Health, the Australian Dental Research Foundation, and the Oral Health Foundation.
Okay, so those organizations really recognize the importance of investing in early childhood health research.
Yes, definitely.
All right, so to sum it all up for our listeners, this deep dive into this recent Australian research has really highlighted a strong link between the practice of bottle feeding toddlers to sleep and an increased risk of both dental cavities and excess weight in early childhood.
Yeah, and the data is quite compelling. It shows almost a doubling of the risk in both of those areas. And this research really provides strong support for the existing Australian guidelines that recommend introducing cups early and stopping bottle use by 12 months of age, and really emphasizing that bottle feeding in bed is not recommended at any age.
It really is food for thought and makes you reflect on, your own understanding and practices around how we feed infants and toddlers, particularly around those bedtime routines.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good reminder to reach out to those trusted resources that we discussed, like Cavities Tresillian and the Raising Children's Network, or to have a conversation with your healthcare provider to make sure that you're establishing the healthiest possible feeding habits for your child.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to consider given these findings. How can we as a community and within our own families better support each other in establishing healthy bedtime feeding habits right from the start to help ensure a healthier future for our children?
It's definitely something to think about.